The night I became someone I don't recognize. I found the photograph on a Tuesday. That detail shouldn't matter, but it does to me. A Tuesday, not a weekend. Not some soft evening when a man might be loose and careless with his emotions. A Tuesday, middle of the week, middle of the afternoon, and I had come home early because my knee was swelling up the way it used to do in the cold, and I just wanted to sit down in my own house and take off my shoes and drink something warm and be still. That was all I wanted. I wasn't looking for anything. The photograph was on the kitchen counter, partially under a folded dish towel, which I moved without thinking because I was going to make tea and I needed the counter space. And there it was. Not hidden, really. Not placed there for me to find. Just there the way things are when someone stops being careful because they've been doing something so long, they've started to feel like it's normal. It was Cynthia and Marcus. Marcus, my best friend since I was 19 years old. They were standing very close together in a way that people only stand when they think no one is watching. Her hand was on the back of his neck. His face was turned into her hair. They weren't kissing. They didn't need to be kissing for me to understand what I was looking at. I've been a man long enough to know the difference between two people who are comfortable near each other and two people who are comfortable inside each other's lives in a way that belongs to no one else. I stood there for a long time. I didn't pick the photograph up. I just looked at it from where I was standing, one hand still holding the dish towel, the other flat on the counter. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a car outside passing slowly. I could hear my own breathing, which had gone shallow and careful, the way breathing goes when the body decides it needs to be quiet while the mind tries to catch up. And then something happened to me. I want to be honest about it because I've never been fully honest about it. Not with anyone. Not even with myself in the clearest moments. What happened wasn't rage. It wasn't the kind of thing you see in movies, where a man breaks down or breaks something or screams or cries. What happened was something much colder than that. What happened was that I became very calm. I put the dish towel back over the photograph exactly the way I found it. I filled the kettle. I made my tea. I sat down at the kitchen table and I drank it slowly. And the whole time I was doing this, something was happening behind my eyes that I can only describe as a door swinging shut. Not slamming, swinging. Quietly. The way an interior door moves when there's no wind and no urgency. Just the slow shift of weight. And then a soft click. And then silence. I made a decision in that kitchen that I never unmade. That's what I need to tell you about. Not the photograph, not even Cynthia and Marcus, not really. What I need to tell you about is the decision, and what I did with it over the next 14 months, and what it cost every person in the room by the time I was finished, because I planned it, slowly, carefully, patiently, the way I'd always done everything. I had built my whole life on patience. I knew how to wait. And I waited. I'm 81 years old now. I'm sitting in a chair in a room that smells like old wood and the memory of good meals. It is late. Everyone in this house is asleep. And I have been thinking about Cynthia and Marcus and who I was in those 14 months. And who I became because of it, and who I never got back to being after. I've been thinking about it most of my life. That's the thing about a decision that comes from darkness. It doesn't finish when the thing is done. It just keeps going. It becomes a room you live in, without knowing you're still inside it. You think you've walked out. You think enough years have passed that it no longer belongs to you. And then, you're 81 years old, sitting alone at midnight, and you understand that you never left. You were always still standing in that kitchen, looking at the photograph, feeling the door swing shut. I need to start further back. Before Cynthia, before Marcus, before the man I became in those 14 months. I need to start with the boy who loved people too simply. My mother used to say I trusted too easy. She didn't mean it as a criticism, exactly. She meant it the way you describe a quality in someone that you love and are afraid for at the same time. She'd watch me bring home every stray child in the neighborhood, every kid with a troubled face or an empty lunch, and she'd look at me with this expression I couldn't read when I was young, but I understand now. It was the expression of someone watching a person walk towards something they can't warn them away from. I was the kind of boy who believed people were mostly trying. That's the simplest way I know to say it. I grew up in a small house in a part of town where the streets were loud in summer and the winters came hard, and the men on the block stood outside together, like they were holding the neighborhood up with their bodies. My father was one of those men. He worked at the plant, 31 years. The same plant, the same shift, never complained that I heard, never said much at all about what that cost him. He came home, and he ate, and he watched the news, and he went to sleep. What I knew about love from watching my father was that it was quiet, and it was endurance, and it was showing up. That was what love looked like to me for a long time. Marcus came into my life when I was 19, first year of working at the postal depot. Both of us young and full of something we didn't have a name for yet. He was from the East Side. He laughed louder than anyone I'd ever known. He had this quality that I recognized immediately as rare, this ability to make a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Like the temperature actually changed. People moved toward Marcus. They always had. That was his gift, and I loved him for it. And I never once stopped to think that a gift like that doesn't discriminate. A man who can make anyone feel chosen will make everyone feel chosen. I didn't know that then. I know it now. We were friends for almost 30 years before I found the photograph. 30 years. I was best man at his first wedding. He held my daughter when she was 6 hours old. We buried his mother together, sitting side by side in that church with our shoulders touching, because that was all we knew how to do with grief back then. We argued about things that don't matter. We ate thousands of meals together. He knew things about me that I've never told a living soul. And he was sleeping with my wife. I don't know when it started. I tried, in those 14 months, to construct the timeline the way an investigator would, building it backwards from the photograph, looking for the moments I'd misread, the phone calls that were slightly too brief, the laughter between them that had a private weight to it. I got as far back as 3 years before the photograph, maybe further. The truth is, I'll never know, and I decided a long time ago to stop trying to know, because the number of years didn't change the shape of the thing. It only changed how long I'd been a fool without realizing it. What I did with that knowledge, though, that's the part I haven't told. Cynthia came home that evening, and I was sitting at the table with the newspaper. I'd been sitting there for 2 hours. The tea was cold. I hadn't turned a page. When she came through the door, she said hello the way she always said hello. That particular way she had of announcing herself to a room like a woman who was used to being noticed. I said hello back. I asked about her day. She told me. I listened. I asked follow-up questions. I watched her move around the kitchen, watched her pick up the dish towel and fold it differently without looking at what was underneath it, and I realized the photograph was already gone. She'd moved it at some point, or she'd come home on her lunch break, which she sometimes did, and moved it then. I don't know. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she sat down across from me at that table, and we had dinner, and we watched the news, and she fell asleep on the couch the way she always did, and I covered her with the blanket the way I always did. And I thought about Marcus. Now here is what I need you to understand about Marcus, because it matters for what comes next. Marcus was not a bad man in the ways that men are usually called bad. He didn't drink too much. He didn't have a cruel bone in him, not toward anyone he could see suffering. He gave money to people who needed it. He coached youth basketball for 11 years. He was the kind of man that people wrote things about in eulogies and meant every word. His goodness was real. I knew it was real. And his betrayal was also real, and I held both of those things. And I discovered in those first quiet weeks that you can love a person and be destroyed by them at the same time, and both things can be equally true. I didn't confront him. I didn't confront either of them. I thought about it. I turned it over the way you turn a stone over looking for something underneath. I imagined the conversation, the shock on their faces, the explanations, the crying, the begging, the whole architecture of it. And I understood something about myself in imagining it that I wish I hadn't understood. I understood that confrontation required me to be wounded in front of them. It required me to show them what they'd done to me, which meant it required me to hand them something. A piece of myself, my pain, my humiliation, the evidence of what I'd believed about my life. I wasn't willing to do that. Some people call that pride. I've called it pride for years, because pride is a word I can live with. But I'm 81 now, and the words I can live with matter less than the words that are true. What it really was something closer to control. I needed to be the one who decided what happened next, not them, not the situation, me. So I decided. I want to describe what I did slowly, because going fast through it would be dishonest. It would be the kind of telling that softens a thing by moving through it quickly. And that's not what this is. Marcus had a business. He'd built it over many years, a construction company, small but respected, the kind of operation that ran on relationships and reputation, on knowing the right people and being trusted by them. He had a contract he'd spent the better part of 2 years pursuing, a large development on the north side, the kind of job that would have set him up comfortably for the rest of his working life. He'd told me about it over those 2 years in the way you tell your closest friend about a dream, carefully, because saying it too loud feels dangerous. I knew everything about that contract, every detail, every player involved. I also knew things about those players that Marcus didn't know I knew, because I had done business adjacent to some of those people over the years, and in that world, information moves between men the way water moves, quietly, finding the low places. I knew that one of the key decision-makers on that project had a particular sensitivity about who he associated with, about the character of the people in his business circle. He was not a complicated man. He cared about appearances. He cared about not being embarrassed. I called him. I didn't lie. That's the detail that stayed with me the longest. I didn't manufacture anything. I simply shared with him certain true things that I knew about Marcus's personal conduct. Not about Cynthia, about something else, something older, an affair Marcus had conducted years before, with a woman connected, distantly but connected, to this man's extended family. A thing I'd known about and kept private because Marcus was my friend, and you keep your friend's secrets. I told it without emotion. I told it the way you'd report a fact you've known for a long time and no longer feel anything about. I said that I thought he should know, given the nature of the business relationship he was considering. I said I wanted him to have the full picture of who he was trusting with a significant project. The contract didn't happen. Marcus never knew why. I watched him try to understand why for months. I watched him rebuild his pitch, reach out through other channels, offer better terms. I watched the slow bewilderment of a man who has done everything right and cannot understand why the door keeps not opening. I sat across from him at lunch and I listened to him talk about it, and I said all the things a best friend says, that these things take time, that his work would speak for itself, that the right opportunity was coming. I am not proud of that. I am not proud of any of it. But I am also not going to pretend I felt nothing when I was doing it. That would be a different kind of lie. The truth is that in those moments I felt something I can only describe as a terrible clarity, like I was finally moving through the world exactly as it was instead of as I'd wished it to be. Like the softness I'd carried my whole life, that tendency my mother had named, that basic belief that people were mostly trying, had been a form of ignorance, and now I was no longer ignorant. That's a dangerous feeling. A man who believes his cruelty is clarity is a man who can justify almost anything. I knew this even then, somewhere underneath the clarity. But I kept going. The second thing I did was quieter. Marcus's wife was named Denise. I'd known Denise for 20 years. Good woman, steady. The kind of woman who holds a family together with her hands without ever being acknowledged for the work of it. She didn't know about Cynthia and Marcus. I'm certain of that. She also didn't know about the older affair I'd told the developer about. She'd had no idea. She believed her marriage was solid because Marcus was good at performing solidity. I didn't tell Denise about Cynthia and Marcus. I told her about the other woman, the older one. I want to be clear about why, because the reason matters. I didn't tell her because I cared about her knowing the truth. I told her because I knew what it would do to their marriage, and I wanted their marriage destroyed with the same thoroughness that mine was being destroyed. I wanted Marcus to lose what I was losing. I wanted him to stand in a house that no longer felt like his and understand what it felt like when the floor drops out from under a life you thought you'd built. I called Denise from a payphone. I know how that sounds. I drove across town to a gas station that still had one, and I called her from it, and I told her what I knew, and I told her gently, the way you tell someone a difficult thing, when you want them to believe you care about them. And then I hung up, and I drove home. 3 weeks later, Marcus's marriage was over. He came to me. He came to me because I was his best friend, and where else do you go? He sat in my living room, and he cried in the way that men cry when they've been holding it so long, it comes out wrong, all bunched up and almost angry. And I sat with him, and I said all the things. I said it would be okay. I said Denise would come around. I said these things take time. I have to sit with that. Even now, I have to sit with what I was in that room. Because here is the thing about what I did. that I can't clean up with context or explanation. It wasn't that I hurt Marcus. He had hurt me, deeply, in a way that maybe warranted hurt in return, and I'm not naive enough to believe the world is cleaner than that. What I can't clean up is that I held his grief in my hands while knowing I was the one who caused it, that I let him trust me, that I was the thing he leaned on when I was the thing that had knocked him down. That is not revenge. That is something else. I don't have a good word for it. After Marcus's marriage fell apart, I still hadn't said a word to Cynthia. 8 months had passed since the photograph. We were living our life. We ate dinners. We went to church. We talked about the grandchildren. She didn't know that I knew. I'm certain of that. She was careful, in the way people are careful when they believe their caution is working, and my stillness must have looked to her like the stillness of a man who simply doesn't know. But I was watching everything. I had become very still and very watchful, the way some animals go still, not in fear, but in a kind of suspended readiness, and from that stillness I could see things I'd never noticed before. The length of a pause before she answered a question, the way her eyes moved when she mentioned Marcus, the small, unnecessary lies that people tell when they've learned to lie about the big things and can no longer feel the difference. I had loved this woman for 26 years. That's the part that doesn't fit neatly anywhere. The love was real. Whatever else was happening, whatever I'd become in those 8 months of quiet ruin, I had loved Cynthia with everything in me for 26 years, and some part of me kept loving her, even as another part of me was methodically dismantling the world around her. That's a hard thing to hold. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't resolve, and I've stopped trying to make it do either. The third thing I did happened at my daughter's wedding anniversary party. We had been hosting it for several years, these parties, because Renee lived close by, and she liked to celebrate in her parents' house, and we liked having everyone together. It was a warm occasion, a good one. Food and music, and children running around, and the particular joy of watching your daughter be happy. I planned it very carefully. At some point during the evening, I took Cynthia aside, very gently, the way a husband takes a wife aside at a party, and I told her I needed to speak with her in the back room. She followed me without suspecting anything, because why would she? In 26 years, I had never given her reason to be afraid of a quiet conversation with me. I closed the door, and then I told her everything I knew. Not in anger. That's the thing I remember most clearly. Not with the heat that the moment seemed to call for, not with tears or raised voice, or any of the performances that a moment like this might invite. I told her in the same tone I used to read the weather report. I told her I knew about Marcus. I told her I knew how long it had been. I told her that I had known for 8 months. And then I told her what I had done. I told her about the contract, about Denise, about the phone call from the payphone across town. I told her all of it, piece by piece, in the same quiet voice, watching her face move through stages I don't have the right words for. I told her that I was leaving, that the papers were already drawn up, that the house was already being listed, because I had transferred it into the name of a trust 6 weeks earlier, through legal means I'd had time to arrange, that her name had been removed from the accounts in ways that were permitted by our agreement, that I had been planning this since the Tuesday I found the photograph, and that she would find things were considerably more complicated than she'd expected when she went looking for what she assumed was still hers. I said all of this without raising my voice, and then I told her she should go back to the party, that Renee's evening shouldn't be ruined by this, that we could give her daughter one more good night before everything changed. Cynthia didn't make a sound. That's what I remember, that she just looked at me with her mouth slightly open and her eyes doing something I've spent years trying to forget, and she didn't make a sound, not a word, not a cry, nothing. She just stood there, and I stood there, and the music from the living room came through the door, something slow and familiar. And then she turned around and opened the door and went back to the party. And so did I. We stood in our daughter's party for another 2 hours. We smiled, we talked to people, we ate cake. I helped Renee's husband fix something with the speaker setup, and we laughed about it. Cynthia stood near the window most of the time, holding a cup she didn't drink from, and if anyone noticed that she was slightly absent that evening, nobody said anything. 2 weeks later, I moved out. Marcus heard about it from someone, some mutual acquaintance. He called me. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. He showed up at the place I was staying, a small apartment I'd rented on the other side of town, and I answered the door because I didn't know how not to. He looked bad. He'd lost weight. His marriage was still in pieces. His contract was gone. He stood in my doorway, and he said my name in this way that I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. Just my name. Nothing else. Like my name was the question and the answer both. I told him I knew. I told him I'd known for a while. I watched his face understand what that meant. Not just that I knew about him and Cynthia, but that I knew it when we'd sat together in my living room, and he'd cried, and I'd comforted him. When I'd listened to him talk about the contract falling through. When I'd sat next to him at his mother's grave on the anniversary of her death, and we'd been quiet together the way old friends are quiet. He sat down on my doorstep because there was nowhere else to go. We sat there for a long time. Neither of us said anything for so long that a neighbor's dog came over and sniffed at us and went away again. And then Marcus said he was sorry. He said it more than once. He said it in different ways, reaching for different words, like none of them were the right shape. And I listened to every version of it, and I didn't say anything back, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood that there was nothing left that words could do. I went inside. I didn't see Marcus again for 7 years. By then, the sharp edges had gone soft, the way sharp things do when enough time covers them. We met at a funeral, a man we'd both known from the old neighborhood, and we stood outside the church afterward in the cold and shook hands, and neither of us quite knew what to do with our faces. He asked how I was. I said I was all right. He asked about the children. I told him. He said they were good kids, and I said they were. And then we went to our separate cars, and that was that. He died 4 years after that. Heart attack. Sudden. He was 63 years old. When I heard, I sat down in the nearest chair, and I didn't move for a long time. And what I felt was not what I expected to feel. I thought I'd feel something clean, some final version of the closure that people always say time brings. What I felt instead was something much older and much harder to name. I felt like I'd lost him twice, like the first loss, the one that happened in that kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, had been the real one, and this was just the confirmation of it, the official document for something that had already been true for years. I grieved for Marcus more than I expected to. I'm not sure I've ever said that out loud. I grieved for who he was before the photograph, before the thing I knew. I grieved for the version of my life where I'd never looked under that dish towel, where I'd made my tea and gone to sit in the other room, and the afternoon had passed the way afternoons pass, quietly, without event, and that version of my life had just continued. I think about that version sometimes, what it would have looked like if I'd never known, if I'd lived out my marriage to Cynthia in ordinary ignorance, growing old beside a woman I loved without ever understanding what was living underneath the surface of it. There are people who would say that would have been better, that ignorance of that kind is a mercy. There are other people who would say, you can't build anything real on top of a truth you don't know. I don't know which of those is right. I genuinely don't know. What I know is what I chose, and what I chose cost people more than I intended, even accounting for the fact that I intended to cost them a great deal. Renee found out about all of it eventually, not at once. It came to her in pieces over years, the way these things come to children of broken marriages, a detail here, a conversation there, and one day she had enough pieces to see the shape of what had happened. She came to me with it when she was maybe 40 years old. She sat across from me at a kitchen table, not unlike the one I'm sitting at now, and she looked at me with the particular expression that daughters get when they are trying to reconcile the father they love with the man he apparently was. And she asked me if it was true. I told her yes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me if I regretted it. And I said something that I've been thinking about ever since, something that came out of me before I decided to say it, the way true things sometimes come. I said, I regret what I became more than what I did. She looked at me like she was trying to understand the difference. I'm not sure there is a difference, actually. I think I said it that way to give myself a little room, a slight separation between the person and the acts, and that separation is probably dishonest. What I became was what I did. You don't do those things and remain someone else. The becoming and the doing are the same. But I'd loved her. That's what I wanted Renee to understand. I'd loved her mother with everything I had for a very long time. And when that love was betrayed by both of the people I trusted most in my life, something happened to the part of me that believed love was enough. Something went out. And what replaced it wasn't hate. Hate would have been cleaner. What replaced it was this terrible cold patience, this capacity for controlled, deliberate damage that I hadn't known was in me. And once you know it's in you, you can't unknow it. That's what I've been living with for 40 years. Not regret exactly, not guilt exactly. Something closer to a permanent altered knowledge of yourself, like finding a room in your house that you didn't know existed, a room that's been there the whole time, and what's inside it is not terrible furniture, but a version of you that you recognize but don't want to. I remarried once, a woman named Gloria, who was patient and warm and who never asked for more than I had left to give. We had 11 good years before she passed. I loved her in a quieter way than I'd loved Cynthia, which is not the same as less. It was just a different shape. By the time I met Gloria, the part of me that loved loudly and without reservation had been replaced by something more careful and contained, and she seemed to understand this without asking about it, which was one of the reasons I loved her. I never told Gloria any of this. I've never told anyone all of it, laid out straight, from the photograph to the end. Cynthia remarried too. I heard about it through the children, at a respectful distance. I don't know who she married or what that life looked like. I've told myself for decades that this is fine, that it's what should have happened, two people going on to separate lives. And I believe that. And I also know that I think about her more nights than I probably should, not with longing exactly, more the way you think about a country you lived in for a long time and can no longer visit, a set of rooms, a particular quality of light in the morning, a voice in the other room that you knew so well you stopped hearing it as sound and started hearing it as just the background of being alive. We're all still living now, I suppose, whatever living means at 81. I have children and grandchildren, and they fill rooms with noise, and they love me, and I love them, and when they are around, I understand what time is for, what all of it was for, and the weight of everything I'm telling you now recedes to where I can hold it without too much difficulty. But they go home eventually. They go back to their lives, which is exactly right, which is exactly what they should do. And I'm left in this chair at this hour, and it all comes back. The refrigerator hums the same way it hummed that day. I'm an old man now, and I understand things that I couldn't have understood at 47 when I stood in that kitchen. I understand that everyone in that story was doing the best they could with the damage they were carrying. Cynthia, with whatever loneliness or need had driven her toward Marcus. Marcus, with whatever weakness or want, made him reach for the thing that belonged to someone who loved him. Even me with my terrible cold patience and my deliberate, methodical cruelty. I was doing something with my pain. I was handling it. Not well. Not in a way I'd recommend to anyone. But I was not simply a monster on a Tuesday afternoon. I was a man who'd loved two people most of his adult life and been demolished by both of them in the same moment. And what he did with that was wrong, deeply wrong. But it was not emptiness that made him do it. It was the opposite. I've thought about that word, evil. It's a word people use, a word I've used myself, looking back at those 14 months. And I think the word fits in the way that certain words fit even when they're too large for the specific thing. What I did was evil in the sense that it was deliberate and sustained and masked, and that I hid behind the face of a friend while doing it. Those things together make a shape that evil is a reasonable name for. But I was not an evil man. Or I was not only that. And the distinction is the one that keeps me awake. Because if I had been simply evil, simply hollow, simply someone who felt nothing, there wouldn't be anything to confess. You confess what you felt and did in full possession of yourself. You confess when the thing cost you something, when it lived inside you afterward as a permanent alteration. A man who felt nothing would not be sitting here at midnight 40 years later, still turning it over. I sat in the church at Marcus's funeral. I want to tell you about that. I sat in the back because I didn't have a right to the front. His children were there, grown now, a son and a daughter who I'd known since they were small and who looked at me with an expression I couldn't read when they saw me. His second wife was there, the woman he'd married some years after Denise left. There were people from the neighborhood, from the old days. There was music that Marcus had chosen himself, apparently, because someone told me afterward that he'd made a list. Of course he'd made a list. That was Marcus, thinking about the room even from outside of it. I sat there, and I listened to people say true things about him, that he was generous, that he made you feel seen. that when he walked into a room, you were glad. All of that was true. I knew it was true because I'd experienced every word of it for 30 years. And I sat there, holding both the truth of who he'd been to me and the truth of what he'd done, and I cried, quietly, in the way that old men cry when they've finally run out of the energy to hold things separately. I cried for Marcus. I cried for the friendship. I cried for the version of us that would have gotten old together, sitting on someone's porch, arguing about things that don't matter, and eating too much, and being grateful for the ordinariness of it. That was the version I'd wanted. That was what I thought we were building. I cried for Cynthia too, in a way. Not at the funeral. Later that night. For what she must have felt when I told her what I'd done. For the look on her face that I spent years trying to forget and never quite managed. I don't think she knew what I was capable of. I don't think I knew either, until I was capable of it. And the moment she saw it in my eyes, in that back room, the moment she understood what 14 months of silence had actually been, I think something in her understanding of the world changed permanently. I gave her that. I gave her a reason to be afraid of quiet men. That's one of the things I carry. My youngest grandchild is 9 years old. She comes to my house on Saturdays, and we sit at this table, and she tells me things about her week with the kind of complete confidence that children have when they believe an adult is fully interested. I am fully interested. I love her with a simplicity that I haven't felt in decades, the simple love that doesn't ask anything of you except to be present. She doesn't know any of this. She knows a grandfather with a bad knee who makes good soup and falls asleep in front of the television. She knows the safe version. I think about what version of me she's going to carry with her. I think about my father, the way he came home and ate and watched the news and went to sleep. What I knew about him from the outside was one thing. What he carried on the inside was something I'll never know, because he died without telling me. Most men die without telling. They carry everything to the end, and they put it down quietly in the dark. And then it's just gone, like it was never weight at all. I've been thinking lately about what I want to put down, not resolve. I don't have resolutions at 81. I've been around long enough to know that the things you did are the things you did, and no amount of understanding them changes their shape. Cynthia's face in that back room is still Cynthia's face in that back room. Marcus, sitting on my doorstep with nowhere else to put himself, is still Marcus on my doorstep. My daughter asking me if I regret it, looking at me with those eyes that are exactly Cynthia's eyes, and always have been. That's still happening, somewhere in me. But there's something about saying it out loud, even like this, even just to the night, and to this chair, and to whatever quietness is listening. Something about not carrying it only inside anymore. I was a man who loved fiercely, and was betrayed, and responded with something cold and careful and sustained. And I have lived with what that made me for 40 years. And I am still not finished understanding it. That's the honest truth. At 81, I am still not finished. I thought older would mean clearer. I thought enough time would make the lines between things more definite, the wrong more clearly wrong, the reasons more clearly insufficient. But it's the opposite. The older I get, the more I understand that everything is threaded together. The love and the betrayal, and the revenge, and the grief, and the years after, all one continuous thread, and pulling one end only pulls the rest of it. I loved Cynthia. I destroyed what I could reach of Marcus's life, I held my friend while knowing what I'd done to him. I walked back into my daughter's party and ate cake. I moved into a quiet apartment and started over. I married a good woman and let her love me without telling her what I'd been. I sat at the back of a church and cried for a man I'd ruined before he ruined himself. All of that is one thing, one person, one life, mine. The night is very quiet now. That particular quality of late-night quiet that feels different from ordinary silence, thicker, more complete, like the world has actually stopped for a few hours to let old men sit in their chairs and reckon with themselves. I've always been awake at this hour, even as a young man, even in the years when I was sleeping next to Cynthia and life felt like it was holding together the way it was supposed to. I'd wake up at some point in the night and lie there listening to the house settle and the breathing beside me and thinking thoughts I couldn't name. I wonder sometimes what I was sensing all those years, if the body knows things before the mind is ready, if that wakefulness was something trying to prepare me. Probably it was just insomnia. Probably I'm giving the sleeplessness more meaning than it had. That's what we do. We look back at everything and we arrange it into a shape that makes sense, that implies we should have known, that suggests the signs were always there. But most of the time, there are no signs. Most of the time, life is just a Tuesday, and you come home early because your knee hurts and you move a dish towel, and then everything is different. I've thought about what I would have done differently, not what the better version of me would have done, the cleaner version, the man in the more admirable story. I know what that man would have done. He would have confronted them. He would have felt his pain openly. He would have cried the ugly cry and raged and grieved and eventually healed in a way that took the shape of growth. That man exists. He's a reasonable man. I just wasn't him. What I mean is, if I had been exactly who I was, with exactly the damage I was carrying and the coldness that lived in me waiting for a reason, what would I have changed? And I think the honest answer is that I would have talked to Marcus before I did anything, not to stop myself. I'm not sure anything would have stopped me, but I would have looked him in the eye first. I would have said, I know. I would have let him see that I knew. I would have let him see me. I never let him see me. That's what I would change. Not the outcome, but the cowardice of hiding my own face. I hurt him from behind a mask, and that's the coward part of it, the part that's harder to forgive than the hurt itself. The hurt I can almost understand, the mask I can't. She's probably asleep right now, wherever she is. I don't know anymore. The children don't mention her, and I don't ask. I assume she's alive, that I would hear if she weren't, that those threads still hold even now. I assume she's in a room somewhere, maybe asleep, maybe awake the way I'm awake, maybe sitting with her own version of all of this. I hope her version is lighter than mine. I mean that. I've spent time in my life not meaning it, wishing things for her that I'm not proud of wishing. But tonight, I mean it. I hope she found something that settled into the life she wanted. I hope she grew old the way you hope to grow old, surrounded by things that meant something, by people who held her right. I hope Marcus would have become what he was becoming before I knocked it sideways. I hope Denise found something good too. She deserved better than what found her, and some of what found her wore my fingerprints. I'm getting tired now. That's how these nights end. Not with a conclusion, but with the body finally outrunning the mind. The mind will keep going. It would go until morning if the body let it. But the body is 81 years old, and it has its own opinions about how long a man should sit in a chair at midnight turning stones over. My knee is hurting again. Same knee that sent me home early on a Tuesday 40 years ago. I think about that sometimes, the small mechanical facts that change everything. If my knee hadn't been bad that day, I would have stayed at work until my regular time. I would have come home to a kitchen where the dish towel was just a dish towel. I might have lived the rest of my life inside a different understanding of who I was and who the people around me were, but the knee swelled up. And I came home, and I moved the dish towel, and the door swung shut. I'm going to try to sleep now. I'll probably lie there for an hour before it comes. That's just how it goes. I'll stare at the ceiling, and the room will be dark and quiet, and the things I've been saying tonight will just keep moving through me the way they always do. And at some point, the exhaustion will win, and I'll go under for a few hours, and wake up with the light coming through the curtains and the day starting up again with its ordinary requirements. Breakfast, the news, maybe my granddaughter calls, maybe not today. The ordinary things, that's what's left now. The ordinary things which I have learned are not small. The ordinary things are what a life is actually made of. And if you are lucky enough to be 81 and sitting in your own chair, in your own room, with ordinary things still available to you, then whatever else you did or didn't do, whatever version of yourself you discovered on a Tuesday afternoon, you are still here. I'm still here. That means something. I'm not sure exactly what, but it means something. The knee, the dish towel, the photograph, I can still see it. That particular way they were standing, her hand on the back of his neck, his face turned into her hair. Two people who believed they were alone. I see it almost every night, not with anger anymore, not with that cold clarity, just with the plain, exhausted recognition of something that happened, something real, something that made me into whoever I turned out to be. And I sit with it the way you sit with an old injury, not because it still hurts the same way, but because the body remembers, and the body doesn't forget, and at a certain age, you stop fighting the memory, and you just let it be there beside you. It was a Tuesday. The refrigerator was humming. I moved the dish towel. And everything that came after, all of it, the cold months, the ruined contract, the payphone across town, the back room at Renee's party, the apartment, the years, Gloria, the funeral, all of it started right there in that kitchen in about 30 seconds while the kettle began to heat, and I stood very still and understood what I was looking at. 30 seconds, 40 years. That's what I've got. That's all I've got. The night is quiet. My knee hurts. I'm going to try to sleep.